Hi, welcome to my series, Does the Bible Tell You So? I'm Dr. Jennifer Bird. I am a biblical scholar, and I care very much about what people do with what they find in the Bible. This is a little sub-series of the Does the Bible Tell You So podcast, and this series is in reference to the book that I have coming out in December. The book is titled Marriage in the Bible, What Do the Texts Say? And I've already done 4 videos in this series, and those 4 videos were addressing the primary passages that people turn to define what they mean by biblical marriage. And so this is the 5th video in the series, and it is based on the 5th chapter in the book. And the 5th chapter is called It's a Matter of Terminology. Now, before you just swipe away because that sounds really boring, hang in there with me, because I think you might be really surprised by what this content actually shows us about the Bible and about how we've been misled about the content in the Bible. Okay? So the first thing is, I've talked about it briefly in the first 2 videos, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit more here. And that is the verbs that are being used in the Hebrew, in that First Testament, Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, that's what I prefer to call it. When you see, and I'm working with English here as the primary language, but it happens in other languages as well. When you see in your translation references to marry, there isn't a verb in the Hebrew that's talking about marrying the way we think of marrying today. They are talking about other things, like taking, as in, I'm going to go purchase this woman from her father. The father will give, Natan, give her to me, and I will take her from him. This is a thing, and that's the most common use. But this is a primary reference, is that when you see marry, actually what they're saying is do not take, or do not, marry, whatever. It's not marry, it's take, okay? The second decently common verb that's being used there is a form of this verb that is chatan, and it's kind of a little bit complicated, but it's used when you're talking about marrying people, when Israelites are marrying other people who aren't Israelites, okay? Whether the Israelite is a male or a female, right? So the issue here is this verb chatan is focused on the fact that the male involved in this marrying needs to have been circumcised. That's what the verb is about. So this chataning thing going on, it's not marrying, it's do we have 2 people coming together, and when that happens, the penis will have been circumcised. I mean, that's what we're talking about. It's all about the covenant and that kind of a thing, but it's really all about men's penises, is what I'm saying here. And what's interesting to me is the verb will be translated to like intermarrying, or marrying with these other people, intermarrying. It's not about intermarrying, it's about this thing going on physically, whether or not they're the proper people. The focus of the verb, right, tells us something about their mentality, the way they thought about it differently than we do, right? The next one is a verb nasa, and it is a verb that is translated to lift or take away by force or with strength or power. And some commentators are too kind and want to say, I'm not sure that's what it really means when we use it here, but why not? Because when we're talking about the Bible, we're talking about content that is very objectifying of women. Women are objects, property. And so there's no reason to say that this isn't happening here. That's a kind human not wanting that to be the case is what's happening, right? And there are a couple examples of the nasaing form, and that is Mahlon and Chilion do that when they're in Moab. Some of the kings that are referenced have regular lachaking, and then some of them have nasaing. Like it just varies. So it's not. Anyway, it applies to all classes, is part of what I'm getting at there. There's another verb that's used, and that's yashav, and that's actually more about dwelling together. So a man forces a woman to live with him, inhabit the same house with him. And this is mostly used with Ezra and Nehemiah, but again, it's not like we're marrying. They're not doing a thing that we call marriage. We have no idea what kind of ceremony they might have had. There are no references to any ceremonies whatsoever in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, there's only a reference to marrying, to a marriage in the Newer Testament. There's no actual reference to the ceremony itself. We don't know what was involved, biblically speaking. So this whole thing, the whole point of talking about the terminology is to point out to you that what's happening in the Hebrew Bible and then also in the Newer Testament is not being accurately reflected in your translations. There is another form, what we might refer to another form of a relationship that some people want to call marriage, and it's the Baal type. So it's this situation where a man, is a lord, because Baal is the same as a god, right? Or is translated as lord when it's used to refer to men. This still is a very hierarchical relationship, right? If he is her master or lord, that's a different kind of relationship than two equals coming together, right? So that's an important thing about the Hebrew Bible. When we get to the Newer Testament, there is something similar going on, and that is there is a verb to marry, and there are references to marrying, right? That whole practice. We don't ever see a wedding ceremony talked about. We see them referenced, right? They're never the focus of any of Jesus's story. Like the wedding itself is never the focus of any of Jesus's stories. Paul doesn't ever talk about marriages or weddings. He talks about whether or not you're married, but not about the wedding, okay? So we have a different way of talking about two people who today, for the most part, these are two people who are relatively seen as equals who get to choose to come together. Not always, but most of the time, and it's usually based on love, and that isn't always the case today either, right? There are arranged marriages that people agree or have no choice in, agree to, something like that, right? I realize that does still happen. But when people today are having a conversation about marriage and who is allowed to be married, usually they're thinking of something that two equals, join, mutually choose to enter into, and that there's a basis in love. And I think that's all really lovely. But there isn't a single example of that in the Newer Testament or the Hebrew Bible of the Christian Testament, of the Christian Bible, okay? That doesn't exist. But you are given the impression that it does because we import our concepts of Mary onto what we see when we see the language that says something very different being translated as Mary. The language originally in the Hebrew Bible is not a sweet, lovely thing, right? There's also the issue of husband and wife, and so for these first two concepts, I'm going to put in some slides here to show you. These are charts that I made for the book, and just to show you what I mean and why it can make a difference, and in particular when it adds up over time, when you realize that this is happening every single time you see the verb marry in the Hebrew Bible, you should replace it with take. Just that, right? And every time you see a reference to husband and wife in the Hebrew Bible, you should probably replace it with man and woman. What does that do? The same is true in the Newer Testament. There isn't a noun to designate a woman before she's married and then a woman after she's married, right? We have ways of saying maiden or miss and Mrs., right? You don't have the same necessarily for men, though we do have bachelor and bachelorette, right? But in the Greek, in the Newer Testament, across the board, we should be seeing man and woman. We see man and woman in the Greek, aner and gune. There's no other noun in the Greek to say, oh, now she's married, now he's married. No, it's across the board. It's just man and woman. It's the translation committees who've decided to translate aner as man here, but here we're going to translate that same aner as husband. Now, is that misleading? Isn't it, if it's in the relationship that we call marriage, isn't it fine to call it that? It would be if what they were talking about looks like what we're talking about. But it doesn't. It didn't. What they're talking about is a situation where a male procures women for the sake of progeny and as the person who will run his household. That's what we're talking about. Now, that might not actually look that different from the marriage you're in or the marriages you see around you and all of that. And that's fine. That's something to think about, actually. But if we want to talk about marriage in the Bible, let's be really honest. What is being said in those texts originally, as best as we can tell, right? They didn't need a label to talk about a man before he gets married versus a man after he gets married. They didn't need that label yet. Think about that. The same is true for the woman who has been purchased, right? She is a woman before she's purchased, and she's a woman after she's left her father's house and belongs to this man. There isn't a label to designate something different. All this tells us is they just didn't have that social construct yet, a label for it. And they didn't think about it in the same way that we do, right? There are some really interesting sidebars in this particular chapter of the book, which I wish I could share with you. I actually think I might upload the one on the language and the etymology of the language for one of the body parts that shows up in most women, which is the hymen. I was utterly flabbergasted when I discovered what the medical field says about the origin of that label versus what's etymologically possible. It's just fascinating. So the etymology of hymen is one of the sidebars, and I will have a link to it in the description of this video. Also, really interesting connections between talking about women as pure and land as pure and how that all plays out intertwined in the Hebrew Bible. Really interesting things, I think, because they are so often discussed with the same kinds of language. So ancient minds, the way they thought about things, interesting things. There's one other term I want to bring to your attention, or category that is in this chapter of my book, and that is this category of talking about virgins or virginity. The concept of a virgin, biblically speaking, is a female who has never been penetrated by a penis, as far as they know. It is a category of humans that is set apart for females. Okay, virgin, biblically speaking. In fact, if you want to talk about male virgins, you have to designate male virgins. You don't have to qualify female virgins if you're talking about a female. It's just a given. It's an interesting thing to consider, right? This is a label for female humans. It's just a really interesting thing to me, right? Kind of like the flip of, we talk about NBA, the National Basketball Association. Well, what if we're talking about the women? Oh, we'll call that the WNBA. We'll have to qualify that as the females, right? This is the flip of that. We're assuming that virgins are females. And if you're going to talk about male virgins, which obviously they're not doing much of, right? Which is also interesting because it doesn't matter. And it tells us something about their mindset that is different from ours. The kind of the boiled down piece here from my perspective is that the concept of a female being a virgin is an entirely male created fabrication. It doesn't actually exist. There isn't really a thing such as virginity. What I mean is, the mark of virginity is to see a woman bleed the first time she has penetrative sex. Here's the kicker, folks. A woman doesn't have to, a human with a hymen doesn't have to bleed the first time they have penetrative sex. In fact, the fact that that person is bleeding is simply evidence of a mild form of violence done against their body. doesn't have to bleed. The hymen is very pliable. It is an incredibly pliable membrane. And if you just give it a little love ahead of time, prepare, it doesn't have to tear because of penetrative sex. Okay? So this concept of a female being untouched by a man, a female being pure because she hasn't had sex, and this label isn't used the same way for men. Ancient context, except for it's still happening today. There's that little bit of, unfortunate reality, right? This concept, this category, is all about a way of controlling female bodies. But this concept is also heavily connected to the ideas around what we call marriage and what we see in these texts related to men taking women and whether or not the women are okay, whether or not the man is pleased with what he finds and discovers. So, there's an interesting example, and I'm going to read from my book at this point. There's an interesting example in the Newer Testament about this concept of virginity. So here I'm reading from the final page of chapter 5 of my book. The final anecdote about virginal terminology in the Newer Testament is in relation to Anna, who is mentioned briefly in Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 2, verses 36 to 38. She is the prophet woman who greets the infant Jesus in the temple. The translations I tend to turn to say something along the lines of, having lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage. Okay, so you can imagine my surprise when I turned to the Greek, and what I saw in more of a wooden translation in the Greek was this: having lived with a man, not her husband, but a man, 7 years since her virginity. Okay. So I'm going to keep reading to clarify this. I hope you know that I do not fundamentally disagree with referring to those 7 years as time that she was married in our context, right? It's just that the Greek indicates that they talked about things and thus thought about them rather differently than we do, right? Marking time since a woman's virginity places the emphasis or importance on something different than saying since she was married. Since she was married implies the whole relationship, since her virginity marks her as important only in terms of whether or not a man has been in the private parts, right? I just want us to be honest about that. And I'm going to read the concluding thoughts also. As a scholar of texts, ancient and current, I cannot help but take very seriously the impact of language on people. I was drawn to the study of rhetoric in graduate school for this same reason. Language is persuasive and powerful. We ought to wield it carefully. I was drawn to the works of scholars such as Pierre Bourdieu and Rosemary Hennessy, who write about the power of language, the materiality of language, how things written or spoken become materialized in communities and cultures. Language is powerful. What we choose to call people or how we characterize a certain physical state, real or imagined, that all matters. We might want to ask ourselves about this aspect about the Bible. There are times that the original, such as we have it, has been perceived to be too offensive to translate directly or woodenly. This is why so many of our current translations take the edge off the rawness in order to make it more palatable for people today. At times, it is to add marital labels, as I've suggested. At other times, it's to add a layer of possession. They use, there will be references to her husband, and in the Greek, it'll just say a man, not her man even, that kind of thing. Other times, it adds a label of possession that might be implied in the original context, but is not specified. But it seems to me that people today would be better served by more honest or raw translations, since there is still an interest in adhering to the ideals set forth in these ancient sacred texts. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you have found something helpful and informative in it for you. If you like the content you're seeing here and the rest of the content in my channel, I'd love it if you'd subscribe, maybe pass along a video link to a friend or two. There are ways you can support me financially through my Patreon account, which is Biblical Bird. Also, if buying the audio of my second book, Permission Granted, I get most of the funds on that one. And supporting me in the release of my book that's coming out in December as that happens. I appreciate all the ways that you support me, and thanks for taking a look.